One movie I really enjoyed growing up is called The Matrix. Maybe you've seen it. But it starts off with Keanu Reeves' character, Thomas Anderson. He's just kind of a guy who works in an office, but he thinks there's something more out there. And he's heard rumors of this thing called The Matrix, and he wants to know what it is. And so he has to go into the dark web trying to figure out what is this. Like, he wants to know more information. And then one day when he's at his office, these men show up claiming to be the FBI, and then he's going on the run, and then he meets these two people, Trinity and Morpheus. I know, crazy names. And eventually he ends up in this room with Morpheus, and Morpheus offers him these two pills, the blue pill and the red pill. The blue pill, he's like, it'll just wipe everything from your mind, and you can just go back to living your life however you like. So, or you can take this red pill. And if you do this, you go down this rabbit hole, and you will understand what the Matrix is and what it is all about, and what's the truth in this world. So Neo, he was in this moment where, I'll call it a crisis of belief, where he has to make this decision, this choice. Does he want to trust Morpheus and to go in and to understand what the Matrix really is, or is it just too much and he wants to go back to his regular life and just forget he ever even heard of it in the beginning? This crisis of belief. And of course, if you've seen the movie, you know he takes the red pill and things just get really crazy after that. But the point of this is just that crisis of belief, this moment in his life where he has to make a judgment. He has to make a decision. What is he going to do? Is he going to push forward and really have his life radically changed? Or does he just want to back off? Like, no. I like my normal life. I like comfort. I like being in my own space. Have you guys, like, in your own life, have you ever had this crisis of belief, this moment, this opportunity in life to make a big decision? You know, it could radically change everything that you know and do. Maybe you had this opportunity you're not in like the job you really love, and so you take a risk, you quit, and you go and switch careers and do something else radically different. Or maybe you have a career change, go back to school, learn something else, and go in that direction. Maybe it's about your dating life and who you date and don't date. That can definitely have a change in your life. And we're constantly throughout our life, we have these moments, these opportunities. Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to step out in faith and do something very different that might scare us, or we're going to have to really put our trust in God? Or do we want to stay back, stay in our comfort zone, and just live in our safe life? You know, as you know, we've been going through experiencing God. And kind of like the first few points that we've gone over already is that one, that God is active. He is doing. He is always up to something in our lives and the world around us. Then we find out that God loves us. He wants to have a relationship with us. And then as we're in this relationship with God, He's going to speak to us. You know, He's going to speak to us through the Bible, through His Word. He's going to speak to us through prayer. He'll speak to us through other believers to speak into our lives. He'll speak to us through circumstances. And then as we're listening to God, as we're listening to what He is saying, it's going to challenge us. And it's going to lead us to this crisis of belief that Henry Blackaby calls it. And it's not this doubting faith. It's not this questioning, is God real or not? Or did Jesus die on the cross for us? It's not that kind of crisis. The crisis is we have to make a decision. What are we going to do? God might be calling us to do something radical, something big. And are we going to step out in faith and trust Him, or are we going to pull back? That's the crisis of belief. The crisis of belief is, are we going to be obedient and do something that the world might say is crazy? Or are we going to, no, I just want to do what I can do. What's within my own powers and abilities. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. And the big idea, the big question is, so how do we handle a crisis of belief? You know, how do we walk through that process? What does it look like? And the story that I'm going to be kind of using as the example is the story of Abraham and Isaac. It's a pretty well-known story, but we'll see how Abraham handles that crisis in his life and how he, just focuses on God throughout it. And so the first point is just this acknowledgement, like, we will have a crisis of belief in our life. If we are living, God-centered, focused lives, like, God is going to put things in our life that we're going to have to stop and be like, okay, what do I do? So if you got your Bibles, I'll be in Genesis chapter 22. I also have the verses on the screen as well. So chapter 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Okay, it gets right into it. And so just a little bit of background. Abraham, he's the father of our faith. God had promised him that he's going to have this son, but he and his wife Sarah were older in their lives, and they're like, we're barren, like we're past childbearing age, like it's not impossible. But God, he blessed them with this son, Isaac. And through Isaac, God promised that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And so this is like just their revelation of God's gift of life and his faithfulness. And now God, as we see at the very beginning, that God is testing Abraham. So us as the audience, we know, like, all right, this is a test, that God is going to be doing something here. And then you read that he's telling Abraham to sacrifice his son. Like, that seems extreme. That seems like unloving, uncaring. But we know it's a test. So we know that God's not really going to have him go all the way through it. But for Abraham, he doesn't know it's a test. He's just like, God's telling me to do this. And that's extreme. And so for Abraham, as we'll see, he's got to think through, like, am I going to do this? Like, how is he going to live this out? It's going to be, I have to imagine this would be a challenge for Abraham. And so Abraham, he's at this moment where he's a crisis of belief. God is telling him to do something else, and then he has to decide, is he going to be faithful and do it or not? I have another movie reference. This is the second and final one. It's just, every great movie has that turning point, that great crisis of belief. This is in the movie's Good Will Hunting. It's a fun movie. The main character is Matt Damon. He's this janitor working at a college in South Boston. And for Matt Damon's life, like, he's just like, a blue-collar worker, but he plays basketball, he gets into fights, rough kind of life. Like, it just assumes that he'll never amount to anything, like he'll just be a janitor all of his life. Like, he's nobody important, he's nobody gifted or talented. And one day, as he's cleaning in the school, there's this big whiteboard with this extremely difficult math problem that this professor has put out there. Like, nobody's ever been able to solve it, not even him. And then Matt Damon just sees it, looks at it for a while, and then he solves it. And he just goes on with his life. He's like, no big deal. But then this professor's like, keeps coming after him, like seeks him out. He's like, who solved this equation? Like, this is impossible. And then Matt Damon's like, I'm nobody. I'm just a kid from Southie. Like, he doesn't want to do anything. But this professor's like, you gotta come. I wanted to do math research with you and just figure out all the cool math equations. But Matt Damon's like, no, I'm just a kid. Like, he has to wrestle with his identity and what he's capable of. But this professor's like, you're capable of so much more. And eventually, Matt Damon relents and he does it, and it leads to a whole host of other things in the movie. But like Matt Damon, he has to wrestle with his identity. Who is he? For him, he sees himself as just a kid from Southie who will never amount to anything else. But this professor's like, no, you are capable of so much more. So I think in our lives, when we have these crises of belief where like Abraham's being tested, like in our lives, we're going to be tested. God's going to grow us in our faith. He's going to challenge us. And then through that, he's going to reveal himself to us. Because God knows who we are. He knows what we're capable of. And so when he's putting us in these moments of decision, it's because he wants us to take that step of faith to push, to grow. He's like, you guys are capable of so much more. He wants us to, again, step out, trust him, and see how he's going to provide for us. And then, man, our faith is going to explode and grow and become so much more like solidified in who Jesus Christ is. So we have to acknowledge that we will encounter these crises of belief. And so my application is that God will test our faith through different circumstances. Of course, not everyone's going to be like, sacrifice your child, okay? That's like maybe once in a lifetime, hopefully, But he's going to have other moments where we're going to sacrifice our conveniences, maybe our comfort, maybe financially sacrifice something, our time, our gifts. But it's up to us to be aware of what God is doing. If we see somebody who's struggling, seems to be in a tough spot. Are we going to maybe stop what we're doing? It's like maybe like, I've got to run all these errands today, I want to get this done, and then sacrifice our agenda for this person who seems to be struggling and seek them out. That is a crisis of belief. Like, what are we going to do? And so we have to have our eyes open and be willing to take those steps of faith. And I want to just be clear as we're talking about doing works and good things. Like, this isn't going to save us. We don't have to work to earn our salvation. We know in Ephesians 2:8 that we are saved by grace alone, not by works. So this is one thing I want to be very clear. Like, this isn't going to define our salvation. That is rooted and secured through the death of Christ on the cross. But our faith, when we live it out, we see in James, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but works is evidence of our faith. Like, faith without works is dead. So us as Christians, if we are following after Christ, we should be doing good deeds. And that's just going to reflect our faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So it's a complicated relationship. It gets murky, but I just want to be sure. We're saved by grace alone, but works is evidence of our faith. Okay, so we're going to experience a crisis of belief in life. And then the second thing we see is during a crisis of belief, we should trust God. That we should just fundamentally believe that God's going to work something out, and we'll see this played out with Abraham. So pick up at verse 3 in chapter 22. So early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. And so we see Abraham immediately, early the next morning. So God spoke to him, and then early the next morning, he's like, all right, let's go. Let's do this. We just see his confidence and trust in God. I mean, I imagine it was a restless night, so getting up early was probably easy for him. And what do? He cuts wood, just trying to process through, I imagine. And he loads everything up, and he takes his son and 2 servants, and they go. Verse 4. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. I love it. So, 3-day journey. I can only imagine the emotions and maybe anxiety that Abraham is feeling, probably trying to avoid certain conversations with Isaac. Just like, yeah, we're going to go offer an offering and a sacrifice. Everything will be fine. But then I love at the end of verse 5, we will worship and then we will come back to you. We see Abraham, he's got this faith. It's like, yeah, God's telling me to sacrifice my son. He's like, but we will come back. We will return. And I love, like, the New Testament gives us a little bit of insight potentially into what Abraham might be thinking. This is in Hebrews chapter 11, it's verses 17 through 19. Now it says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So the author of Hebrews is kind of filling in a little bit of gaps, possibly what Abraham was processing. Abraham's faith, I mean, we see it in verse 5 in Genesis, where it's like, we will worship, we will return. Abraham had this confidence that no matter what happened, he truly believed that Isaac would come back with him, that God would perform some miracle, that he would provide or sustain the life of Isaac. Again, like Abraham, before this point, like his faith journey has been up and down. Because there have been moments when they've been like traveling to cities and they are about to enter in, and then like the king or the gatekeeper is like, oh, look at this beautiful woman. Like, is this your sister? Is this your wife? Like, who is she? And Abraham's like, it's my sister. And then the king's like, oh, I will marry her. But then it comes out that, no, this is actually Abraham's wife. And again, through those, even Abraham's like not being completely faithful, God is faithful and protects them in that lineage. And then even like when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham's questioning God, like, like, what if there's like 100 people? Will you save them? And God's like, no. He's like, what if there's 50, 40, 30? It gets down to like, even there's one person. He's like debating, trying to rationalize with God. And we see his faith maturing and growing where God's like, go sacrifice your son. He's like, okay. We just see him growing in his faith and trusting God. And so God is doing one more test. Continue on here. Verse 6. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here. Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. See, this section here makes me think that this isn't the first time Abraham and Isaac have gone off to provide a burnt offering. Because Isaac's like, hey, if we're going to provide an offering, we should have an offering. Like, it makes logical sense. And I love in the Hebrew, in verse 7, where it says, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, like the Hebrew author actually wrote, like, Isaac said, and like a comma, and like, Isaac said. It's redundant. It's almost like Isaac was attempting to speak up. He's like, Father. It's like there's this hesitation in his voice because he's rightfully concerned. He's like, if we're going to offer a sacrifice, there should be a sacrifice. But then we see Abraham's faithfulness. He's like, God will provide the sacrifice, be it his son Isaac or something else. Abraham was confident and trusted in God. I mean, it's just amazing to see his own faithfulness and trust and in his creator with these promises. You know, there's been moments where I've had to trust other people that they had the big vision of what was going on. And a few years ago, I had a friend who was like, hey, Steve, you want to help me build a drum cage? I'm like, okay. And he was fully aware of my carpentry skills, which was zero. But he was just a generous guy. He's like, I'll teach you. It's like, we'll use a saw, we'll use all sorts of other equipment for building said drum cage. And like we spent a whole afternoon making it. It was a lot of fun, but at one point I remember we were going to put trim around the front of the drum cage of the stand. That was all wood. And instead of just having just straight boring pieces of trim wood, he's like, hey, like we should put like maybe a diagonal edge on them or round them out. He had like a whole case of like 20-some drill bit heads that could put a different finish on the trim. Again, I knew none of these. I didn't know what would look good or what not look good. Like I was just out of my element. I was like, Charlie, just tell me. Just pick one. Like, I don't know anything about this stuff. He's like, just pick one. He's like, it doesn't matter. Like they'll all look great. Because he had the big picture. He's used all these tools before. Like he know how they would all look out. He's like, Steve, I want you to make this choice. I'm like, but I don't know what I'm doing. He's like, it doesn't matter. They'll all look great. Just pick one. And finally, I picked one that I'm like, this kind of looks nice. It has like a little rounded edge on it when we get done. And wouldn't you know, it looked fine. It looked great when we were done with it. But I had to trust him that Charlie, he knew the big picture. He knew how all these pieces were going to fit together and how it would look at the end. And I just had to pick one. So for us, you know, our application is like we should trust God no matter the circumstances. He's got the big picture. He knows how things are going to work out, but it's up to us to take those steps of faith and trust him. Again, in our personal lives, we have these decisions. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to step out of our comfort zone. You know, we like protected, we like predictability. I think a lot of us do. Some of you might be like, I thrive on chaos. But I'm not one of those people. I like to know like the next steps, what's coming down the road. But when God like tells me, like, Steve, do this. Like when I went to seminary, it's like, quit your job, move to Chicago. I was like, this is crazy. I know nobody. But God was faithful. He knew the next steps. He knew the people I was going to be around. Like he had everything worked out and where I was going. Again, it's scary, but if we do it, man, God is going to meet us where we are, and he's going to do big things and encourage us, and our faith is going to grow. So then the next time we have another decision to make, it'll be a little bit easier. Or maybe the stakes will be a little bit higher, and then we're, all right, God, I'm going to grow my faith some more. But we should trust him, because he's a loving, gracious God. And the challenge for us as a church as well. Are we trusting God? I mean, it's amazing in the book, just all the different stories of how churches are like, oh, like this church needs a pastor. And they found somebody who's like, yeah, I'll be their pastor. And they're like, this is roughly what I need for my salary. And they're like, oh, but we don't have any money. And then like this pastor who's like willing to come is like, that's okay, we've been saving up money. Like we can live off our current salary for the next year and we'll figure out the year after that. And then when the person arrives at the church that they're going to serve at, there's this other random church that's like, oh, I heard you guys were doing some mission work. Like, here's like $10,000, and that's the perfect exact amount that this pastor needed for a yearly salary. Again, this was like many, many years ago. But again, like God would provide exactly what they needed, exactly the right time. And these individuals would step out in faith, trusting God, and God would always meet them where they were. Yeah. And like it's just amazing. We're in week 7. I'm like, surely he would start repeating stories, but he's not. Henry Blackaby continues to have another story of faithfulness of how God is providing, how God is moving, God is doing big things, and it's a convicting workbook to go through and be like, okay, what are we as a church doing? Like, how are we trusting God? Like, are we confined to our budget? Are we doing bigger things as well? And so I just hope us as a church that we're willing to be free with what we have and that we can grow and really trust God that if he calls us to do something that seems ridiculous, then we're like, no, we serve a big God. Like he's going to do God-sized things. Why would we want to hold back and do things within our own comfort zone? So that's been just a real challenge for me and Ryan as we've been talking about this stuff. Like, all right, like how as we as a church can practice this as well, that we can trust God. So again, we're going to have a crisis of belief. And second, we see that we should trust God. And then the third thing we see is we move forward in faith that God will provide what we need. So again, it's not just lip service. It's not just saying, yeah, I trust God. Yeah, God is good. It's like, no, we got to put it into action. And we've been seeing that with Abraham and his preparations, but now he's getting to the mountain and where he's about to do what God is telling him to do. So we start off in verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Like this part, the first 8 verses we covered like 3 or 4 days. Like the story is moving like so fast. And then we get to verse 9 and it's like it's just slowing down. You're getting it beat by beat. Like, okay, they reach the place. Abraham's building the altar. I'm sure he's just dragging his feet because he's like, all right, God, I need you to show up. Like, I'm going to do this. It's about to happen. And then he binds up his son. Again, like Abraham's old in age, 90, 100 years old. And his son is in his adolescence, young adults. Easily could overpower his father, but we see Isaac's just humility and submission to his father. But again, the story is not about Isaac. It's about Abraham being tested. But again, so we see him binding up, lays him on the altar. Well, not just on the altar, but on top of the wood. And then we see him reach out his hand. And we see his intentions to slay this child. I mean, it's just like slow motion happening. Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So God intervenes, like right at the last moment. You just picture like the knife high, and God's like, Abraham, Abraham. And then Abraham's like really like, oh, here I am. Like, thank you. Like, and just this, don't do anything. Stand still. It's like he wasn't willing to withhold anything. Like he was going to trust God. Verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So we see God provides. His son was destined to be slain, but then the last moment, the angel of the Lord speaks, stops it, and then provides a ram to take his place. And there's so much imagery in relation to Jesus Christ on the cross. So for us, we were destined to death and eternity away from God, but then God interceded. Jesus took our place so that we might have forgiveness of sins, so that we might avoid that eternal death apart from God. And we continue on in 15. The angel of the Lord called to Abram from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through their offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. And so at the end, the second time the angel speaks, it's reconfirming all of the promises that God had made to Abraham back in chapters like 12 or in 13, where he would have the descendants as numerous as the seashore, that he would have the promised land in Israel, and thirdly, that his descendants would be a blessing to the world. And I love that from the very beginning, even in the Jewish faith, like the intention was never to have this insular society in Israel, but that they would be the light for the world, that they would be able to model like their love and who their God was, and that would attract people, and that the world would be blessed through them, and that's fully realized through Jesus Christ. That's all made possible. And then just, in verse 19, it quickly wraps up that Abraham returned and everything was hunky-dory, And we see just, Abraham's faith in action. And I love how in James, he talks about, Abraham's, his faithfulness and his works. Because again, as I mentioned, like James's argument was that faith without works is dead. He said that the two have to come together. It's really important. So in chapter 2, verse 20, James wrote, You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. So we see James, he's talking, like, the story of Abraham and Isaac is like so important, and it's referenced many times even in the New Testament. But we see Abraham's faith and his actions coming together to make it complete. I mean, yes, when we submit our life to Jesus Christ, and accept the work of his son done on the cross, we make that first action of submitting to him and believing in the work of Jesus Christ. And then we have that first action. But then God is going to continue to challenge us to grow and to do more things. And through that, like, our faith will be made complete. It will be sharpened. It will grow. It will be sustained as we're doing this, as we're living it out. Because if we just have our faith, but we're just living the lives we want to do it, like, we're going to be missing out on so much. Yes. And of course, we're saved by grace alone. We'll have eternal life. We will have the forgiveness of sins. But the more we live it out, the more we put it into practice and do it, we will continue to experience more of God's goodness and his blessings through us. Well, the idea that came to my mind as I was thinking about this was, getting an education, going to college. And like, there's different ways to learn. Like, yeah, you can sign up for the classes as a student and do all the homework and tests, and like, man, you will be blessed. And at the end, you'll get that certificate, the diploma. But there's also, you can audit courses. But if you just audit a course, like, you're just going to sit in a classroom, but then you're not required to do any homework. You're not required to take a test. Then, of course, if you're auditing, you're not going to get a diploma either. You'll just get the head knowledge, which is great. It's good to do at times. But I think the thing that stuck out to me is like, okay, us in our faith, are we just auditing who God is? Come to church on Sundays, learn about who God is, and we'll be okay. Like, that's all we need, just kind of doing the bare minimum. Yeah, you'll learn, you'll get to know about who God is, and you'll have a good understanding, but then you're not doing the homework. You're not taking the tests. You're not putting it into practice. That's a conviction. It's a struggle. It's like when we're Monday through Saturday, what are we doing? Are we living out our faith? Are we doing all the homework? Are we living it out and really trusting God and seeing what he might be doing through our lives? So again, like, I think my final application here is like, our faith is revealed when we live out our trust in God. again, it's an easy thing to say, like, I love God, I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, I love him and what he stands for and what he's doing, but then are we living it out? Are we actually putting it into practice and doing it? And when we do that, like, we reveal our faith to the world, and sometimes we reveal our faith to ourselves because we don't understand how much we might trust God. But then when we take these steps of blind faith, trusting God, like, we're like, oh wow, like, I do trust the Lord. Oh wow, like, God is going to meet me where I am. Oh wow, that God is going to do something great and big. And like, we'll grow and we'll just get to experience God in new, powerful ways. So again, I challenge you all, and like myself as well, as we're living this out, as we are seeking God in our lives, that we can, when we have these moments where we have big decisions to make, I pray we can move forward them trusting God, that he will be there every step of the way, that he's got the big plan figured out, and then thirdly, that he will provide exactly what we need. Like he provided the ram for Abraham, like he will provide for us the knowledge, the skills, the words for whatever might come our way in life.